Good evening. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Marion E. Wade Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you back for part 2 of this year's Ken and Jean Hansen Lectureship. Just as a reminder, these lectures are an annual occurrence here at the Wade, and they're named in honor of former Wheaton College trustee Ken and his wife Jean, and endowed in their memory by Walter and Darlene Hansen. Drawing on C.S. Lewis's comments about why we read, Walter Hansen explains that a primary goal of this lectureship is, quote, to explore the great literature of the 7 Wade authors so that we can escape from the prison of our self-centeredness and narrow parochial perspective in order to see with other eyes, feel with other hearts, and be equipped for the practical deeds in real life. This year's lecture, Dr. Aubrey Buster, an associate professor of Old Testament here at Wheaton College, is an absolutely wonderful guide in all of these respects. And this point was driven home to me earlier this week as I read the introduction to her book, Remembering the Story of Israel, which was published by Cambridge. The Old Testament, I learned, not only contains long narratives, like the Exodus narrative, it's also full of brief historical summaries of those narratives. And these summaries served really important functions for the people of God. The forms were formative, socially, liturgically, historically. In a society in which literacy rates were low, or fairly low, these miniature histories were transmitters of cultural memory. Remembering the Story of Israel explores these matters in great detail. I can't do justice to it here, of course, but let me give you 2 very brief takeaways. Takeaway 1, the Hebrew Bible is remarkable. This is true. At one point, I looked up from the page, and I remember thinking, the B-I-B-L-E. Yes, that's the book for me. Takeaway 2, Dr. Buster is a remarkable reader. She knows how to interpret texts. And as we saw in her first lecture, that's true not only of the texts of Second Temple Judaism, but also of the works of C.S. Lewis. I can't wait to learn where Dr. Buster's readings will take us next. Following Dr. Buster's lecture, Dr. John Walton will respond. Dr. Walton is a professor of Old Testament Emeritus at Wheaton and a prolific author. A few of Dr. Walton's books include The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, and The Lost World of Scripture. Also, Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament, The Essential Bible Companion, and NIV Application Commentary on Genesis. He and Dr. Buster are co-authoring a forthcoming 2-volume commentary on the book of Daniel, which will be published by Erdman's. So, we've got an exciting evening planned. Please join me then in welcoming Dr. Buster back to the podium for her second Hansen Lecture, Here Be Dragons, C.S. Lewis and the Construction of the Monstrous.
Thank you for that generous introduction and for reading my book. Yes, no one does that. No, it is a great pleasure to be here again with you all tonight to spend some time with the monsters. I feel the need perhaps to give a spoiler alert. They don't win. Yes. In 1936, J.R.R. Tolkien gave a lecture that would recenter the study of monsters in the 20th century and would eventually give rise to an area of study known as monster theory. In his essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, it is clear that he prefers the monsters to the critics. He begins the essay with an anecdote that sets the tone, in which one scholar writes of another, and you'll need to follow this joke. I have tried to lend to others the conviction I have long entertained that Dr. Bosworth is not a man so diligent in his special walk as duly to read the books which have been printed in our Old English, or so-called Anglo-Saxon tongue. He may do very well for a professor. In this lecture, Tolkien similarly rebukes the top Beowulf scholars of the day for fundamentally misreading the poem. And their misreading is most serious at one particular point. They do not understand the role of the monsters. And because they do not understand the monsters, they do not understand the story. He holds up one scholar for particular criticism. This scholar, William Kerr, notes that the primary fault of Beowulf is that there's nothing much in the story. The hero is occupied in killing monsters. And unlike Hercules and Theseus, to whom Beowulf is compared, the problem is Beowulf has nothing else to do. That monster killing is Beowulf's primary occupation is viewed as cheap, simple, making the main things peripheral and the peripheral things, the monsters, central. Another critic, Professor Chambers, compares Beowulf unfavorably to the story of Ingolf and his feud with the great Scylding House of Denmark because of its more elevated themes. While the latter story features a conflict between plighted troth and the duty of revenge, Beowulf's conflict is with a mere dragon. In the eyes of these critics, the monsters of Beowulf cheapen its significance. It is not proper for those of correct and sober taste to demonstrate such interest in fantastic creatures and ogres and dragons. The monsters are a distraction, and the critics judge instead that a heroic or tragic story on a strictly human plane is by nature superior. Doom is held less literary than hamartia, sin. Tolkien vehemently disagrees. To excise the monsters, according to him, would not be a surgery that preserves the vitality of the poem, but one that would leave it dead on the table. The monsters are necessary, not only for the poem, but for its elevated rhetoric and long-standing significance. He insists that the monsters are not an inexplicable blunder of taste. They are essential, fundamentally allied to the underlying ideas of the poem, which give it its lofty tone and high seriousness. For Tolkien, it is the monsters that tie the conflict of the poem between the warrior Beowulf and his various foes to the great conflicts of this age, the war of humans and gods against a hostile world. It elevates the poem from one of mere conflict, just an adventure story, to conflict with the forces of enduring hostility to humanity and its frail efforts at order and art upon earth. The monsters of Beowulf also occupied Lewis's imagination from a young age, and he loved them not only for the excitement that they offered to the story, but for the feeling that they produced. Perhaps what Tolkien would call a lofty tone and high seriousness. In a letter to his childhood friend Arthur Greaves, written when Lewis was 17, he describes his experience of reading Beowulf in this way. When I was reading it, I tried to imagine myself as an old Saxon thane, sitting in my hall of a winter's night with the wolves and storm outside and the old fellow singing his story. In this way, you get the atmosphere of terror that runs through it, the horror of the old barbarous days when the land was all forests and when you thought that a demon might come to your house any night and carry you off. The description of Grendel, and Grendel is the main monster of Beowulf, stalking up from his fen and fastness, thrilled me. His interest in Beowulf's monsters is not limited to his youth. In another letter written to Greaves in 1930, he describes a winter afternoon as taking on its Grendel hue. I think that I have had a few Grendel-hued days myself. Lewis also interacted with Tolkien's ideas about Beowulf, referenced above. In his essay, The Idea of an English School, first published in 1939, he references the contrast that Tolkien draws between the monsters of Greek epic and those of Anglo-Saxon epic. Tolkien notes that in Greek mythology, the monsters are often presented as children of the gods, and since they are descended from deity, they are also defended by deity. The Cyclops, for example, in the Odyssey is described as God-begotten, and when Odysseus successfully maims him, this is construed by Poseidon as an offense against the deity. Grendel, however, is described as one who bears the anger of God. He is the common enemy of both gods and humans. Both Grendel and the Cyclops are devourers of men, but in only one poem do the gods fight against the monsters on the side of humankind? Lewis describes the contrast between the function of the two monsters in this way. Grendel is so dark, so mysterious, so fitted to be the central symbol of evil in a great poem. The other, that is, the Cyclops in the Odyssey, so matter-of-fact, so accidental, so blasphemously tracing his descent from a god, though he is the enemy of man. The monsters and their nature matter very much indeed to the meaning of a literary work. In another essay on stories, published in 1947, Lewis again asserts the importance of the fittingness of monsters. He pushes against critics, though he doesn't quite go so far as Tolkien, who asks if the critics can even read, but Lewis pushes against those critics who reduce the monsters to a plot device designed to introduce danger to the story. Instead, he notes that what comprises the danger, the monster, its body, characteristics, and connotations, are what make the story. A giant, for example, carries with it heaviness, that monstrosity, that uncouthness, the intolerable pressure, the sense of something older, wilder, and more earthy than humanity. Different kinds of danger are suitable for different kinds of stories, and the marvels in good story are never mere arbitrary fictions stuck on to make the narrative more sensational. So too for the monsters of the apocalypse. The monstrosity of the apocalyptic beasts are not mere arbitrary fictions designed to make the narrative more sensational. In my previous lecture, I argued that during Lewis's lifetime, biblical scholarship was marked by a disinterest, even embarrassment, at apocalyptic themes. The Jewish and Christian apocalypses were characterized by one source as stale, flat, and unprofitable, a religious backwater opposed to the living stream of prophecy. Lewis's character Ransom in Paralandra, when apocalyptic themes are described by Tor, notes that what Tor's referencing are called the last things, and that most of his generation have ceased to think of such things at all. In that lecture, I argued that Lewis perceived the apocalyptic imagination of his generation as malformed, beholden to a counter-mythology of ongoing progress, a mythology mutually exclusive to that of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic, in which we await, with eager expectation, I might add, the ending of the world drama, suddenly, without warning, and the beginning of something new. The monsters in apocalyptic literature have also been treated as embarrassing, too pagan, or as merely symbolic. Such monsters are, to remember the critics of Beowulf cited by Tolkien, unsuitable for those of correct and sober taste. One of the reasons that Bultmann argued for demythologizing the New Testament was that, well, no one believes in those demonic satanic powers, one brand of apocalyptic monster, anymore. Rudolf Schnackenberg, in his 1959 work, God's Rule and Kingdom, writes, confrontation with the monsters is actually bad for us. He says, dwelling on fantastic nightmares, this conscious excitement of anxiety and fear, these are heavy shadows on the picture otherwise so radiant of universal perfection, and they're a blot on the apocalyptic writers who created them. They represent a flight into a world of visions and dreams. The most common treatment of the monsters in apocalyptic, however, is to explain them away as ciphers. The task of the interpreter is to solve the puzzle, to figure out what they really signify. For monstrous beasts coming out of the churning sea in Daniel 7, well, which four empires do they represent? Which political figure is the beast of Revelation 13, who rises out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads? And for a many pages on which empires they are, see Walton and Buster. So we are among the number of those who identify these monsters. Now, it is important interpretive work to locate the monsters in their historical context. They do represent earthly empires, real historical empires. And the definitive identification will be made at the end of this year. But to claim that the monsters can merely be replaced with humanly led empires without remainder is to lessen their significance and to miss a key feature of their import. As Lewis said in his essay on stories, one cannot simply replace one danger for another. The example that he gives is the substitution of a subterranean volcanic eruption instead of being buried alive. One cannot simply replace one danger with another and have the same story. Or as Tolkien notes, the monsters are not a mere blunder of taste. How much more so for the visions of sacred scripture? So then, what is the purpose of a monster's monstrosity? Or to put it another way, what is a monster good for? I'm going to do my best to describe an answer that I think Lewis and the apocalyptic authors might give. And I'll have four answers to this question tonight. 4 theses, we'll say. First, the images associated with the monstrous recall stories and structures far larger than themselves. As Tolkien says, it is just because the main foes in Beowulf are inhuman that the story is larger and more significant than this imaginary poem of a great king's fall. It glimpses the cosmic and moves with the thought of all men concerning the fate of human life and efforts. It stands amid, but above, the petty wars of princes and surpasses the dates and limits of historical periods, however important. One might say that with the apocalypses, it is just because the empires are represented as inhuman monsters that it connects those historically circumscribed ancient conflicts with conflicts that we have continued to fight from that point up until today. In the apocalypses, it is made clear that the monsters we meet have not just arisen with the Babylonian, Persian, Greek, or Roman empires that ruled in the period in which they were written. The visions communicate that the foe that Daniel sees, that the Jews and Christians of his age will meet, is an ancient foe, though it takes a particular imperial form at that moment. The monsters connect the threat of that time to the threats that humans have been confronting since the beginning generations of the world. Thus, we see a pattern in which biblical monsters and Lewis's monsters cluster at the beginning of the world and reappear in full force at its end. Monsters who appear in the middle are often associated with genealogies that connect them all the way back to an ancient ancestor. We see, for example, in Daniel 7, that the hybrid monsters that Daniel sees in his vision are birthed out of a primordial sea. I saw in my vision of the night, look, the 4 winds of the heavens were causing a disturbance in the great sea. 4 great creatures emerged from the sea, each different from one another. While the images of the wind and the sea recall the language of creation in Genesis 1, in which the Spirit hovers over the waters, the thrust of this imagery is different. Instead of one spirit hovering over the waters, multiple winds churn the sea from every direction. Daniel 7 can be compared to Enuma Elish, the great Mesopotamian creation story, where Marduk uses the 4 winds to confuse Tiamat, the personified sea and the representative of chaos. It is also in Enuma Elish where Tiamat, this chaotic sea deity, is described as creating an army of monsters. It states, she gave birth to giant serpents. She created the Hydra, the dragon, the hairy hero, the great demon, the savage dog, and the scorpion man, fierce demons, and the mighty bull, carriers of merciless weapons, fearless in the face of battle. While Tiamat is defeated in this ancient conflict, her monstrous children continue to roam the earth and are the subject of ongoing myths and stories about the conflict between order and disorder in the ancient Near East. The Book of Enoch also describes the birth of monsters in the far distant past, mere generations from the beginning of the world. It locates the beginnings of these monsters in the enigmatic reference in Genesis 6, 1-4, which describes the sons of God taking for themselves the beautiful daughters of men. Enoch identifies these sons of God with the angelic watchers, some of the very inner ring of heaven who stand around the throne of God. It is these watchers who descend upon the earth, interbreed with human women, teach to them the secret arts of sorcery, magic, and even what we might call art and science. The offspring of their union are the terrible giants who beget the Nephilim, and they are described in this way. They were growing in accordance with their greatness. They were devouring the labor of all the sons of men, and men were not able to supply them. And the giants began to kill men and devour them, and they began to sin against the birds and the beasts and creeping things and the fish, and to devour one another's flesh. And they drank the blood. Then the earth brought accusation against the lawless ones. According to the book of the Watchers, it is the accusation of the earth against these giants that leads God to destroy almost every living thing in a flood. These monsters are birthed at the beginning of this present earthly age, conceived at moments of primordial power, lust, and violence. While the individual iterations of these monsters are defeated and die, the monstrous itself is with us until the end of the age. Now, based on what I've said so far, you might be wondering why I argue that the monsters are good for something, yes? And why, in particular, I think that for Lewis, as well as for the apocalypses, true wisdom and virtue is impossible without an encounter with a monster. So I come to my second point. It is in the confrontation with the monstrous, in truly seeing and rightly responding to it, that the wise are revealed. For Lewis, encounter with a monster is an encounter with a category of the numinous. In fact, Lewis introduces the idea of the numinous in the problem of pain through the introduction of a monster. Suppose you were told there was a tiger in the next room. You would know that you were in danger and would probably feel fear. But if you were told there is a ghost in the next room and believed it, you would feel indeed what is often called fear, but of a different kind. This fear, the fear of a ghost, a basic monster, he calls dread, and it is motivated by an encounter with the uncanny. Lewis's concept of the uncanny is derived from Rudolf Otto. Otto equates the uncanny with the German Das Ungeheure, the monstrous, which can mean something huge in size beyond our faculty of space perception, but can also mean the fearful and the incomprehensible. It's associated with the numinous. For Otto and for Lewis, who cites Otto, the shudder of dread, or the thrill of horror that one feels at the word ghost, is the feeling appropriate to contact with the dauntingly other. Lewis discovers instances of this fearful numinous in several literary works. But there are two categories that I want to mention in particular. He highlights the encounter with the numinous in the apocalyptic literature and in children's stories. He writes that a description of the numinous experience is found in the Apocalypse, that is the book of Revelation, where the writer falls at the feet of the risen Christ as one dead, and in the visions of heavenly beings in Ezekiel, which describe the rings in his theophany, that they were so high that they were dreadful. And he finds it in children's literature. The example he gives is the scene in Wind in the Willows, where Rat and Mole approach the island on which Pan dwells. Rat, he found breath to whisper, shaking, "Are you afraid?" "Afraid?" murmured the rat, his eyes shining with unutterable love. "Afraid? Of him? Oh, never, never. And yet, oh mole, I am afraid." Now, the numinous itself is neither equated with the morally good nor morally evil. It simply describes that which is dauntingly other. As Otto writes, the numinous is present in the ideas of the demonic and angelic world, which surround, transcend, and permeate this world of ours. An encounter with the monstrous, though, which I'm using as an example of the numinous evil, still reveals to us an encounter with a being of another order, beyond the human. The particular thrill of dread or shudder of horror that we feel in confrontation with the monstrous can be the beginning of a particularly apocalyptic wisdom, a knowledge that, in the words of Paul, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. But the teaching of the monsters does not end there. Here's my third point. In the apocalyptic literature, it is the wise who correctly see the monsters and correctly respond. This confrontation is never comfortable. The description of the responses of the apocalyptic visionaries to these monsters read as a laundry list of physical maladies. They are sickened within themselves, paralyzed with terror, knocked unconscious, fall down as though dead. Even when the visions assure them of distant victory over the monsters, this does not quell the fear at their arrival. Part of the purpose of the instruction of these apocalyptic texts is that we might watch the wise figures respond to their discovery of these monsters. So too Lewis, in his stories, both for children and adults, confronts us with monsters, and we see the responses of the characters: foolish, evil, wise, and heroic. I want to turn now, in my remaining time, to the monsters of Lewis's classic children's work, The Chronicles of Narnia. It is no coincidence that we meet the first monster of the Chronicle at the end of one world and the beginning of another. And thus, while we do not know her particular origin story, we know the ending to which she leads. This is, of course, Queen Jadis, the White Witch. In her own words, spoken at the end of her world, "It is silent now, that I have stood here when the whole air was full of the noises of Charn, the trampling of feet, the creaking of wheels, the cracking of whips and the groaning of slaves, the thunder of chariots and the sacrificial drums beating in the temple. I have stood here, but that was near the end, when the roar of battle went up from every street and the river of Charn ran red. All in one moment, one woman blotted it out forever. I, Jadis, the last queen, but the queen of the world." In Charn, we see a world, much like the world of Beowulf, in which the story ends ultimately in defeat. It is also for Lewis the world in which his great counter-myth, the subject of my last lecture, has come true. This is the myth of continual progress, in which humanity becomes a race of demigods who rule the planet. And yet, and this is his quote, "all this time nature, the old enemy who only seemed to be defeated, has been gnawing away, silently, unceasingly, out of the reach of human power. The sun will cool, all suns will cool, the whole universe will run down, and all ends in nothingness." Jadis, the White Witch, is the final monster of this counter-mythology. And in Charn, she is victorious. As she herself states, though, under the blood red of a dying sun, "It is cold here at the end of the world." Now, when we meet Diggory, one of the human protagonists of The Magician's Nephew, he is hardly counted among the ranks of the apocalyptic wise. But his education begins when he starts to sense the queen's monstrous identity. Or more precisely, I should say, his education continues, for it begins with his encounter with Uncle Andrew. More on that in a moment. Hardly human was what Diggory thought when he looked at her, that is, Jadis, the White Witch. And he may have been right, for some say there is giantish blood in the royal family of Charn. More information about her lineage, if not her full origin story, is revealed in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. As Mr. Beaver explains to the Pevensey children, she comes of your father Adam's, here Mr. Beaver bowed, your father Adam's first wife. Her they called Lilith. And she was one of the Jinn. That's what she comes from on one side, and on the other she comes of the giants. No, there isn't a drop of real human blood in the witch. The White Witch, then, is described as descended on two sides from mythical, primordial beings. Lilith, a mythical demon who precedes Eve, and the giants, the offspring of the fallen angels of Genesis 6 and the books of Enoch. Though the children meet her here for the first time, she embodies an ancient evil. I want to go back to Tolkien, who reflects on the significance of connecting monsters to old evils. Grendel, the first monster to be defeated by Beowulf in that epic, is described as a descendant of Cain. As Tolkien notes, by tying Grendel to Cain, the first murderer, the threat that Grendel poses is no longer understood as unique, but as one manifestation of the power of darkness with which Christian men felt themselves to be encompassed. He symbolized, this is a quote, he symbolized the powers of evil even while he, that is Grendel, remains a mortal denizen of the material world. So too Jadis embodies not just the monstrous possibilities of Charn, but also the evil that characterizes our world. In fact, if she is of the blood of Lilith, Adam's wife, the evil she brings into Charn and then into Narnia, she brought from our world in the first place. What she represents is not a new threat, but an old one that has existed ever since human creation. As Lewis reflects in a letter to William Kinter, written in 1954, the witch is, of course, Circe, Alcina, etc., because she is, and they are, the same archetype we find in so many fairy tales. No good asking where any individual author got that. We are born knowing the witch, aren't we? As the witch ends one world, she becomes the original evil in another. She is brought by Diggory and Polly into Narnia. As Aslan states, though the world is not 5 hours old, an evil has already entered it. Lewis reflects in one letter on his own thoughts concerning the primordial nature of evil. He writes to Ruth Pitter that he believes the pre-human earth already contained suffering. This is why, like our fathers, we must believe in the fall of the angels long prior to the fall of man. Our fall consisted in joining the wrong side in a battle which had already begun. It is also in the tales related to the White Witch that Lewis presents the possibilities of human participation in the monstrous. One can join the wrong side in the battle. In The Magician's Nephew, Uncle Andrew plays a human counterpart to the witch. I'll add that in the Space Trilogy, her role is played by Weston. While Diggory is the person who rightly discovers the nature of the monstrous, she's hardly human, he declares, his realization of this begins in his encounter with Uncle Andrew, his human uncle. Diggory's uncle clearly acts evilly. There's no wondering whether he's a good or bad man. But there are hints that he is, through participating in the monstrous, becoming the monstrous. Before we even meet his character, we see him through the eyes of Diggory, who remarks on his creeping nature and the fact that he has such awful eyes. The eyes are deeply associated with the nature of the uncanny. Unnatural eyes being a sign of that which is claiming to be human, but isn't. Strange eyes are a feature of many of Lewis's monsters, including those of the human variety. When the children, Polly and Diggory, accidentally arrive in Andrew's study, the hints of the monstrous continue. He fixes the children with his bright eyes and smiles, showing all his teeth. A correlate of Uncle Andrew's participation in the monstrous, ironically, is that he can't see it when it is in front of his face. It is unclear which comes first, the inability to correctly perceive the monstrous, or one's own participation in the monstrous, but it is clear that one threatens the other. The hints of this blindness begin early. In his conversation with Uncle Andrew, Diggory asks of the woman who gave him the dust to make the magic rings that help him move from world to world. Wasn't there something wrong about her, Uncle Andrew? He asked. Well, said Uncle Andrew with a chuckle, depends what you call wrong. People are so narrow-minded. She certainly got very queer in later life, did very unwise things. That was why they shut her up. Diggory asks if she was shut up in an asylum, and Uncle Andrew corrects him. She was shut up in prison. This process, long and continual, leads to Andrew not being able to correctly perceive a real live monster as she stands directly in front of his face. To him, there is nothing unnatural, strange, or eerie about Jadis at all. She is a dem fine woman. He claims, Andrew that is, claims to be the possessor of hidden wisdom, to be a profound student, great thinker, and a sage. But though he has some power, he is not wise, and thus can't even properly see Jadis for who she truly is. And the one who cannot see the monstrosity of Jadis can also not hear the goodness of Aslan. As Aslan states near the end of the book, he, that is Andrew, has made himself unable to hear my voice. If I spoke to him, he would hear only growlings and roarings. O Adam's sons, how cleverly you defend yourselves against all that might do you good. In his influential essay, Monster Culture, 7 Theses, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen writes that no monster tastes of death but once. No matter how many times King Arthur killed the ogre of Mount St. Michael, the monster reappeared in another heroic chronicle, bequeathing the Middle Ages an abundance of more Darthurs. In the book of Daniel, too, the monsters are defeated only to reappear again. In Daniel 7, the beast with the loud-mouthed horn is slain and thrown into a blazing fire. Yay! Only to reappear as the antagonist in slightly different form in Daniel 8, where it grows great enough to cast down some of the starry host itself from heaven. A similar beast arises again, the great dragon of Revelation, that then sweeps away a third of the stars and casts them to the earth. One thing to note about monsters is that while they may be killed, they never die. As Tolkien writes of Beowulf, his fight with the dragon is not a war to end war, or a dragon fight to end dragons. It is the end of Beowulf and of the hope of his people. He actually ends the essay, until the dragon comes. Yes. Even after Jadis has died, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I'm sorry to give that away, yes. The possibility for her particular monstrosity to reappear remains a threat as long as Narnia endures. In a particularly chilling scene in Prince Caspian, a hag and a werewolf are speaking with a band of discouraged Narnians and encouraging them to recall the strength of an ancient power, that of the White Witch. When Dr. Cornelius states that the White Witch, who of course Jadis becomes, is dead, killed by Aslan, the hag responds, "Oh, bless his heart. His dear little majesty needn't mind about the White Lady, that's what we call her, being dead. The worshipful Master Doctor is only making game of a poor old woman like me when he says that. Sweet Mastery Doctor, learned Master Doctor, who ever heard of a witch that really died? You can always get them back." The monsters will always be with us to the end of the age. And yet, in the midst of the construction of the monstrous and the ongoing battle between the forces of good and evil, the evil is never the equal of the good. This is my fourth and final point. I noted in my last lecture that the apocalypses are the most dualistic of the biblical writings. They feature cosmic forces of good and evil portrayed on a heavenly scale. These cosmic forces take the form of angels and demons, as well as monsters, beasts, dragons, who are divided into a hierarchy of orders, assigned to roles, and called by name. This emphasis on the stark portrayal of the good and evil can lead, however, to a false sense of their equal valuation. But in the apocalypses, just as in the chronicles, the forces of evil are never equal to the good. They remain subordinate to God. The monsters are monstrous, ungeheuer, huge in size, beyond our faculty of space perception, fearful and incomprehensible. The wise are fearful of them. And yet, as Lewis states in The Great Divorce, which will be the primary subject of my final lecture, hell is small, smaller than one pebble of this earthly world, and smaller than even one atom of the real world. It is in the last battle where we witness most clearly Lewis's expression of this fundamentally uneven dualism, an uneven dualism that I think he shares with the apocalyptic texts. It is in the last days of Narnia, when Narnia will actually end, and evil will, for a moment, win before it dies, that we see evil's comparative smallness. The last battle begins with an ape and a donkey in a lion's skin. Leslie Baines, in her forthcoming book on Lewis and Scripture, notes, I think accurately, that the opening scene that describes the ape, Shift, and the donkey, Puzzle, beside Cauldron Pool, presents a reimagining of the image of the beasts from the sea tradition of both Daniel and Revelation. Cauldron Pool is described as a, quote, big pool right under the cliffs at the western end of Narnia. The great waterfall pours down into it with a noise like everlasting thunder. The waterfall keeps the pool always dancing and bubbling and churning round and round as if it were on the boil. Poor Puzzle, the donkey, enters this pool to retrieve the lion's skin, and the swirl caught him and carried him round and faster, till it took him right under the waterfall itself. Puzzle barely makes it out of this pool, but when he does, he dons the lion's skin and becomes a hybrid beast, a monster. But the most pathetic monster Narnia has ever seen. And yet this part donkey, part lion, deceives all Narnia, because they know neither what a monster or Aslan himself really looks like. The wise are too few. Thus, not only are the Narnians taken in by this ape masquerading as a man and donkey masquerading as a lion, but they succeed in calling into Narnia a truly fearful monster, the great hybrid monster Tash. Tash is described in this way. It was roughly the shape of a man, but it had the head of a bird, some bird of prey with a cruel curved beak. It had 4 arms which it held high above its head, stretching them out northward as if it wanted to snatch all Narnia in its grip. And its fingers, all 20 of them, were curved like its beak and had long, pointed bird-like claws instead of nails. It floated on the grass instead of walking, and the grass seemed to wither beneath it. Portrayed as another figure who receives worship, it is tempting initially to see him as Aslan's counterpart. This is in fact a theme of the story, that shift and the Calormens attempt to convince the Narnians that Tash and Aslan are the same. But neither are Tash and Aslan the same, of course, nor are they counterparts. Tash, it appears, remains subordinate to Aslan. Even at the end of the age, this terrible creature is presented as under Aslan's control. In the scene where Rishta Tarkhan discovers the consequences of summoning Tash, that is, he comes, the monster receives its rightful prey. With a sudden jerk, like a hen stooping to pick up a worm, Tash pounced on the miserable Rishta and tucked him under the upper of his 2 left arms. Then Tash turned his head sideways to fix Tyrion with one of his terrible eyes, for of course, having a bird's head, he couldn't look at you straight. But immediately from behind Tash, strong and calm as the summer sea, a voice said, "Begone, monster, and take your lawful prey to your own place in the name of Aslan and Aslan's great father, the Emperor over sea." Aslan and Tash are not on the same side, and yet Tash remains beholden to Aslan's command. Finally, we witness the ends of the monsters. The monsters do not make it into real Narnia, into which the heroes of the story enter, but die, finally, with the destruction of the old. In our last glimpse of Narnia in the last battle, when the stars themselves have fallen from the heavens and the sky of Narnia is dark, the monsters come forth for their final act of destruction. The dragons and giant lizards now had Narnia to themselves. They went to and fro, tearing up the trees by the roots and crunching them up as if they were sticks of rhubarb. Soon Tyrion found that he was looking at a world of bare rock and earth. You could hardly believe that anything had ever lived there. The monsters themselves grew old and lay down and died. Their flesh shriveled up and the bones appeared. Soon they were only huge skeletons that lay here and there on the dead rock, looking as if they had died thousands of years ago. For a long time, everything was still. There go the dragons. So they are the last monsters, and they only die as the world itself dies. So what is a monster good for? According to the apocalyptic texts and Lewis, the monsters have been here since at least our beginning and will be with us till the end of this present evil age. They are not peripheral to the story and cannot be excised from it. And yet, in confrontation with the monster, in truly seeing it, and in refusing participation with it, the wise are revealed. Thank you.
Are monsters extraneous? Tolkien thinks not, as expressed in his contentious quarrel with the critics of Beowulf. And we can heartily agree. After all, monsters are not extraneous to life. So why should they be extraneous to literature? In the literature of the ancient Near East, as well as in the book of Daniel, the monsters represent that which is contrary to order, whether it is the chaos of non-order or the threat of disorder. It is noteworthy that order finds its meaning in the context of those conditions that contrast it, whether they linger on the perimeter or threaten our very core being. In the apocalyptic vision of Daniel 7, chaos is represented in the beasts from the sea, monsters that personify the reality of empire. In the Babylonian world, order is the created condition that results once the god Marduk has defeated the chaos creature Tiamat and her army of monsters. She is the embodiment of the sea, the ultimate reservoir of chaos. Here be dragons. It is noteworthy in contrast that in Genesis 1, unlike both the Babylonian epic and Psalm 74, Israel's God does not slay the monster. Indeed, the monsters are part of his good creation, Genesis 1:21. Not only is this unlike the Babylonian Enuma Elish, where the god must do battle with the chaos creature, it is also unlike the Greek stories of Hercules or Theseus, where the heroes must slay the monsters. Against all conventional Christian interpretation, in Genesis 3:15, God informs humanity that the consequences of their choice to pursue their own order rather than his is that they have therefore taken the combat with the serpent chaos creature onto themselves. Not heroically, tragically. And also, contrary to common Christian interpretation, the verse fails to indicate who will win. Instead, it envisions the continuing exchange of potentially mortal blows. Tolkien summarizes this trope in the Norse literature with, quote, man, alien in a hostile world, engaged in a struggle which he cannot win while the world lasts, end quote. Though there it becomes part of the heroic tale that Tolkien speaks of. Scarcely could Genesis 3 be configured as a heroic tale. Nobility has no caste in the narrative. Yet it tells us something of great significance. The monsters are us. Here I move one step further from Dr. Buster's reference to human participation in the monstrous. Whether we think of the human empires of the book of Daniel, or the human inclinations that we all face daily, as much as we might objectify the monsters in literature or in theology, Satan and demons, we cannot banish them from the mirror. The real monsters are us. The most dangerous chaos is not among humanity, but within humanity, within each of us. We are Smeagol, with Gollum lurking in the shadows, harboring an obsession with precious. That is why monsters so commonly find a role in literature. They reflect our heart of darkness. And in our recognition of that fact, we are predictably inclined toward elaborate makeovers of the monsters. Consider Milton's Lucifer, the most compelling creature of Paradise Lost, or the more modern permutation of the noble Memnoch the Devil in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. Epic literature and mythology are most powerful when we recognize ourselves more easily in the monsters that terrify us than in the heroes we beatify, though the latter give us something to which to aspire. The literature of monsters and heroes, then, whatever genre labels we might use, is what I like to call reality literature, whose characteristic monsters cannot be so easily dismissed as superfluous or extraneous. Just as truth is often stranger than fiction, the monstrous experienced in reality is often stranger than the fabulous. Perhaps it would be a startling claim to suggest that all good literature is reality literature, as it reflects the human soul in many diverse ways. Yet a catalog of many varied exemplars would brook no denial. The Beowulf of Tolkien's attention is no less reality literature than Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. The realities that are reflected in the Gilgamesh epic are just as acute as those in the apocalyptic visions of Daniel. Enoch's Book of Watchers and its modern permutation in Madeleine L'Engle's Many Waters holds no less powerful a reality than Alfred Lord Tennyson's expansive recitation in The Charge of the Light Brigade. The power of Lewis's space trilogy, or his Chronicles of Narnia, and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, is in the way that they help us to encounter the most important realities, not least of which is the monstrous. Not in allegory, but in metaphor. This very perspective is the point of Tolkien's poignant observation, quote, "A dragon is no idle fancy." It is rather an apt metaphor for the realities that linger at the periphery of our vision as we read. Any attempt to focus on them may find them vaporous. For as Tolkien again observes, myth is alive at once and in all parts, and dies before it can be dissected. End quote. The fight against chaos creatures is pervasive, whether heuristically configured in myth or recognized in our daily realities. More often than not, when we confront them in closest combat, we find that they are of our own making. Not our own fictional invention, but our own terrifying, real creation. The chaos creatures against whom we struggle, mirror our own shameful desires and our worst inclinations. Who will I be today? Ransom or Weston? Gandalf or Saruman? Uncle Andrew or Emmett? We cannot, however, fully understand monsters without turning our attention to endings, because monsters and endings are not unrelated. Here I will build a bridge between them, partly in anticipation of Dr. Buster's third lecture, because good endings find their apotheosis in the aftermath of monsters. A sunset without clouds is unremarkable. As Hrosa the Huoi says to Ransom in Out of the Silent Planet, "I do not think the forest would be so bright, nor the water so warm, nor love so sweet, if there were no dangers in the lakes." In the Babylonian creation epic, chaos is defeated to make room for creation. In Daniel, they hope for the kingdom of God, the ending that will undo empire. In our Christian theology, we understand that the battle has already been won by Christ and that his kingdom is already upon us, though not yet a fully lived reality. This theme is not unknown to Tolkien and Lewis, as the defeat of monsters of various stripes opens the way for good to be realized. The ordered life of Hobbiton, the rest found in Valinor, or the excitement of true Narnia as they go further up and further in. The valences of monsters and endings are determined through memory, another topic of Dr. Buster's research. Monsters are reified through memory's continual retellings, where they are then reconfigured in relation to real or more often anticipated endings. Recall Galadriel's prologue in the movie version of The Fellowship of the Ring. History became legend. Legend became myth. This beautifully summarizes how the destiny of tradition unfolds. We can unpack it further. Memory orders the ceaseless flow of time into discrete events. And as memory becomes story, we provide beginnings and endings to give meaning to the memories of the monstrous, to find pattern in it all, to make sense of it. Though the edges of past life and its struggles dull with time as the light of memory fades and its shadows merge in dormant hibernation, our stories are haunted by half-forgotten tunes, elusive melodies of joys and sorrows. Even that which has been forgotten is never fully lost. It leaves footprints, windswept, eroded, yet still detectable. For even the forgotten battles are forged into the becoming. As Tolkien observes, one does not have to wait until the end, until all the native traditions of the older world have been replaced or forgotten. For the minds which still retain them are changed, and the memories viewed in a different perspective. And so it is that every humming of the tune changes it and shapes it into what it has made us become, whether as humans or as humanity. We are not only the monsters, we are also the endings. Our stories remind us of who we are, and their endings distill our hopes and aspirations and sometimes our fears. Yet as our stories merge with the stories of others, fears can become hopes, and what we are changes because of what we become together. Those are the stories that Tolkien and Lewis tell. Remembering, forgetting, becoming. Even sad endings can be good endings as they shape us. Even what strikes fear in us becomes our remaking, as Eustace experienced when Aslan helped him shed his monstrous dragon form. The book of Daniel also anticipates happy endings in the aftermath of the monstrosity of empire, and chooses to focus on the hopes cherished by its characters, rather than seeing them immolated in the fires of the destruction of Jerusalem or shackled by the shock of exile. Lewis's Jadis here finds resonance in Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian conqueror. Tolkien's orcs have become the Seleucid tyrants in league with the Jews' own Saruman, the traitorous high priest Menelaus. Valinor is not some place out of this world to which heroes sail off from gray havens. It is rather the anticipated kingdom of God breaking into the world of the Jews to annihilate the tyrants of human empire. Imperial might replaced by the reign of God. This anticipated happy ending does not reflect Daniel's present, which remained populated by monsters. It is an aspiration to which they grimly cling with determined fists. The monsters will be defeated, and order will reign. Such is the shape of hope. As Sam Gamgee dreams of a once again peaceful life with Rosie in Hobbiton. In Narnia, the Pevensey children grow into mature kings and queens, ruling the land in benevolence. In The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, that looks like a happy ending. And for Narnians, it sounds like a happy ever after ending. Of course, the other Narnia books show us that that is not yet the end. But what about the ending for the Pevensies? Suddenly they're children again. not regents. They spill out of the wardrobe right into the waiting room there. Spill out of the wardrobe back into the drab and war-plagued world, not Narnia, however fervently longed for. What hopes are there in the monster-filled world when the desired ending is still future? Daniel's circle of faithful Jews faced a similar dilemma in the monstrosity of their circumstances. The monsters that ruled them were equaled by those from their own number whose betrayal bit deeper. After the centuries of hardship under Babylonian, Persian, and Hellenistic rulers described in Daniel 11, Daniel 12 addresses the hopes the Jews have, even in the turbulent and threatening times in which they live, a time when their dragons still held sway, still far from the endings for which they yearn. Many have thought that Daniel 12 offers the first hints of bodily resurrection, a doctrine firmly attested in the New Testament. But evidence for that interpretation of Daniel is fraught with problems. In the Daniel commentary that Dr. Buster and I have written together, we conclude instead that what Daniel anticipates is a different sort of ending. A resurrection, yes, of sorts, but not in bodies, but in stories. Hope is found in stories. Here I will conclude by invoking Doctor Who in his reflection that we all become stories in the end. Though he's not one of the Inklings, yet. The Time Lord's insights are related to the hopes that Daniel weaves for the faithful of his time, plagued by monsters and awaiting the final arrival of the kingdom of God. A paraphrase of Daniel's encouragement goes something like this: "We are but lingering shadows that soon fade as they dissipate into the mists of time. Only a few experience resurrection from memory to story. That is, they awake from the dust of faded memory to take on new life as their stories are retold without endings, like the constellations of the heavens that enshrine stories of the unforgotten. Their stories will broadcast their legacy. Some, those monsters who now oppress us, will live on in infamy, villainized through stories that subject them to repeated scorn and reproach in endless cycle. We must never cease to tell those monster stories. Others will be immortalized in stories that will echo through time and eternity, inspiring generation after generation to have hope in their undaunted pursuit of righteousness and wisdom. The faith of the Jews was in God Most High, the true Time Lord. Stories typically have endings, yet they linger in the memories of those who read them and continue to be perpetuated as they shape the becoming of generation after generation of readers. That is their legacy as their endings transition to new endings for all readers who encounter them. The stories of the hobbits and the Pevensies, of Ransom and Weston, of Beowulf and Grendel, all came to an end in their respective literatures, though they continue to affect all of us who have read them. Daniel's story has not yet reached its ending. His hope, and all of ours, is not simply for Grey Havens and Valinor, but for the true Narnia, which we will experience as the new heavens and the new earth under the rule of the Most High. As the book of Revelation, a wonderful piece of apocalyptic, yet reality literature, tells us in that new creation, there was no longer any sea. The chaos that always has threatened to encroach will have no place in that ending, any more than the sea monsters that inhabit it, the empires of human history, have in Daniel. And best of all, the monstrous that is in each of us, that bane of our humanity, will be banished, and we will be healed. No longer fixated on the distorted monsters that we encounter in the mirror, but focused on the face of Christ. May God preserve us till we have faces. Thank you, Dr. Buster, for inspiring us.
All right, we now have time for a Q&A, so I'll invite Dr. Buster and Dr. Walton back up to the front. As they're getting seated, I just wanted to let you know that all of our Hansen books are 20% off tonight, so you can get any of those 20% off. And they are ready to take any questions you might have, and I will circulate with the microphone. Any questions?
I can start, Jim.
Oh, yes. Go for it.
Okay. So, Dr. Buster,
Yes, Dr. Walton.
you have identified for us the story motif of gods defending monsters.
Yes.
So tell me, do you find that motif in the biblical text?
Yes, this is a really good question. And I actually, let's see how to frame this. So one of the confusing parts of the biblical witness, well, particularly the apocalyptic witness, is that the apocalyptic texts are both the most dualistic. That is, they build up the conception of the monster the most starkly, the most darkly, yes, the most monstrously, and yet they also maintain most powerfully the sovereignty of God. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the tension that we continually see. That there is nothing to create a monster besides God. Mm-hmm. We see, as you mentioned, God is the creator of chaos. God celebrates this in Job, where God says, not only did I make Leviathan, I play with him in my off days, kind of thing. Yes, yeah, exactly. And so I think we see a tension that doesn't fit either into the Beowulf model, where the gods fight on the sides of the humans over against the monsters and lose, or in the Greek model, when the gods kind of play favorites. Sometimes they like the monsters, sometimes they like the humans, yes? We see a model in which God is not on the side of the monsters, but God is still in control of the monsters. Mm-hmm. And that's the tension that we're working out. Mm-hmm. That primordial sea that we see in Daniel 7 is the sea of creation. Mm-hmm. And there's no other source for the monsters to come from. There's no early darkness that is over against God, that is fighting, that can explain the monsters. And it's why we can know how the story will end, yes? But it's also why we can be sure that the monsters will come. Yeah. So I actually think that the children's story that Lewis presents in that moment, rereading it for this lecture series was the first time I realized that moment, that Aslan commands Tash, this horrible deity who's been, who accepts human sacrifice, it's described as, and often leads people astray, that Tash itself is under control of God. And I think that's the tension of the apocalyptic literature. Yeah.
Good.
Oh, what do you think?
Well, I mean, some things that could come close to that.
Yes.
You know, when God puts the mark on Cain, that's not defending him, but it's protecting him.
Oh, yeah.
So a little bit of that. When we see Nebuchadnezzar as God's instrument for punishment, Nebuchadnezzar might think he's doing it on his own, but that's not the testimony of the text. So there again, not God defending him, but working alongside of him. The one that really intrigues me is the possibility of Cyrus. Because Cyrus, of course, treated as the anointed one, an anointed servant in Isaiah, yet he's represented by one of the beasts in Daniel. Yeah. And so the idea of God being able to use the monsters in his economy of plans and purposes. Again, not quite defending them, but yeah, working alongside them.
Yeah.
Dr. Buster, thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it very much, and you certainly underlined the importance for Lewis, of monsters in the overall creation. But it occurred to me, thinking about some of the things you're saying, that there's kind of a parody of monsters in Lewis as well,
Yes.
or unmonsters. I mean, Ransom is terrified to meet the Sorens. In fact, he's brought to
Yes.
Malacandra in order to be a human sacrifice to them.
That's right. That's right.
And he only goes to them eventually because he has no other choice. He's running for his life.
Yeah.
And he discovers they're very friendly, if somewhat snobbish, intellectuals.
Yes.
He, in Perelandra, the unman calls up this gigantic centipede-like creature who is terrifying to look at. But when the unman dies,
Yes.
the creature kind of confusedly and comically stumbles away.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
And then in Till We Have Faces, Psyche is going to be sacrificed to the beast on the mountain, whom everyone is terrified of. But
Yeah.
it turns out the beast is a stand-in for Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Does that, how does that
No,
relate?
this is. I'm so glad you asked this. I'm so glad you asked this. I had a section on slightly related to this that I took out. So, one, for Lewis, the truly monstrous in the sense of the evil is always an export from Earth. Yes. So when Ransom goes to Mars, he expects to meet monsters, real Martian monsters. And the only monster who ends up on Mars is Weston. Yes. Same thing in Perelandra. I think in Perelandra this is even starker because in the scene when you meet the equivalent of Eve, yes? And a dragon shows up in Perelandra, but it's a tame dragon. And there's this scene where she, pats it like a dog. Because on Perelandra, where the evil has not been introduced, there are no monsters. The what we view as monsters, the dragon and things, are mere playthings. I also think we see extended in these scenes this connection that became clear to me reading Lewis alongside the apocalyptic texts of the realization what a monster is as being an aspect of wisdom, that it isn't always obvious. When you meet, that haunting scene where I was afraid of, I remember reading Out of the Silent Planet, like by myself on a dark, stormy night, and I'm like, I can't even when the Sorns arrive. And they're not the monsters, yes, and Ransom has to realize that. And same thing with the dragon, with the centipede, right? This realization that there are both things that we don't think are monsters because they look beautiful, like Queen Jadis, right? Polly is the wiser one at first. She's like, I don't like this lady at all. And Diggory's like, wow, you're 7 feet tall and look amazing. So this process of not recognizing the monsters at first and coming to recognize them, and then thinking something is a monster and realizing it isn't, are two sides of the same coin, I think, in Lewis. So I'm really glad that you highlighted those aspects and brought them out.
I might add to that that in Out of the Silent Planet, the one creature that could stand in the place of monsters, the Hanakra, the sea,
That's right.
the sea beast that actually brings destruction and death. But yet they see it as beautiful, and I used that quote
Yes.
that kind of made that contrast.
That's right. That's
So
right.
there is a monster,
That's a
but
great
it's
addition.
not
Yeah.
viewed in monstrous terms.
Right. That's a great point.
Thank you both very much. Thinking about something that each of you said, the wise are revealed in their response to the monstrous, and yet we are the monsters, reminds me of know thyself. And thinking about where does that appear in the stories of the Inklings. Two that come to mind are perhaps Faramir saying, I would not take this thing if I found it on the way, and Lucy perhaps with the nudging of Aslan when she looks into the book of the magician. But perhaps are there others that come to mind of self-knowledge?
Yeah.
Well, even Caspian in the chair has a very distorted view of who he is, and it seems like it's the moments of madness when he actually knows who he really is in his right mind. So that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah, several. One who I was furious at myself for taking out was Edmund, of course, yes. because Edmund is the one who is taken in by the witch and begins to be the monstrous. There's even the scene where the beaver, says, I can always tell when someone has spent time with the witch. You can tell by their eyes. So Edmund is on the path towards monstrosity, so to speak, but that ends. So I think we see this throughout as a theme. Diggory is faced with those moments of choice. Does he go into that walled garden as he should, or does he jump over? There Lewis speaks about the way in which we're tempted to participate in the monstrous for the sake of good. Yes? So will you participate in the monstrous to save your mom? That's a really good question for all of us. Prince Caspian, that scene, the rest of that scene, where the hag says the monster never dies, or where the hag says, the White Witch, she's never dead. They're asking, you have an enemy. Would you like to defeat them with monsters? So I think that's a constant tension, that they're confronted with the monstrous, and occasionally it's tempting. Sometimes they don't recognize it as such. There's a naivete right there, the foolish. And sometimes they say, we know it's a monster, but we're going to call it anyway, because we desire that power, that control. So yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Picking up on that same question, but now turning to the biblical text. Dr. Walton, you introduced this idea that we are the monsters. And there's this discussion of, the monsters do represent empire, but they're bigger than that.
That's right.
There seems to be a temptation, I think, sometimes to read the monsters and immediately apply them to other. Here's my question. Is there also a warning, though, for us as readers when we read apocalyptic literature about the temptation to become the monster?
That's a good question. Let me just tell you my own questioning of this process, because the construction of the monstrous is a dangerous game to begin to play. Yes, because we tend to, the construction of the monster is the construction of the other. The sentence, we are the monster, is rarely spoken. The other is always the monster. And so we tend to associate those with whom we do not agree as the source of the monstrous. And I think what was helpful to me, I did a lot of learning in this lecture, yes, in writing this lecture. So what was helpful to me was seeing how the issue comes when we attempt to construct a new monster, rather than realizing there's never a new monster. They're always the same. They are always being birthed out of those primordial moments of lust, greed, violence, and the desire for power. And the risk, I think, is when we say, oh, we've defeated those, we need to construct some new one on the edge of the world, and we're going to associate with this people group or that people group, or something like that. So the realization that the monsters are in some sense always the same has helped me, I think, differentiate that from the danger of the construction of new monsters that aren't associated with these things. But yes, that's always a temptation to see, which is why we need to read more children's stories. Yes?
I wonder too whether we see the struggle about identifying the monsters again in Hellenistic history of Judaism, with
goodness, yes.
Menelaus, the renegade high priest, who purchases the high priestly office and then participates in the oppression of Antiochus IV Epiphanes on the Jewish people. The people of that time weren't always clear that to be on Menelaus' side was to be on the side of the monsters. And so it was easy for some of them to become part of the monstrous, whereas others, of course, saw a path of wisdom to say, no, that's not the direction we should go. But it looked very seductive in the moment that they should follow along in that path of Hellenization. And so I think there we can see some...
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the more curious monsters that C.S. Lewis comes up with that you didn't mention, I'm sort of surprised you didn't, was Eustace Scrubb.
Oh, they're there's so many I didn't mention. Yes.
But, I mean, but Eustace
there's a
is
time
such an
limit on these
anomaly
things.
because
I know, yes.
how he becomes a monster,
Exactly.
his attempt at self-cure
Yes,
versus
yes.
real cure.
Of course.
And that has always been one of those that fascinated me
Yes.
on how
Yes.
C.S. Lewis handled that.
And he's the best example. Lewis is very good at doing the same thing many times in many different skins. Yes, Eustace is the one who doesn't realize the monstrous, and Eustace is the one who doesn't realize the monstrous, and Lewis takes lots of stabs at his education because of this, right? There's a reason he doesn't recognize it. It's because he goes to modern schools and eats like special food, right? He's got he calls his parents by their first name, right? So he hasn't been trained to represent the monstrous, and I think this is key to Lewis's point about the development of wisdom. He hasn't been able to do that. And so he can't recognize a dragon's treasure trove when he walks in. And so in succumbing for a moment to a dragon's greed while thinking dragonish thoughts, he becomes a dragon. It becomes a dragon. And he's required to, and this is of course key in the Great Divorce as well, right? So many monsters. He's required to see it, right? To see that in his reflection, to confront it, and then to defeat it. Except in that case, it's actually a defeat of himself. He's wounded, right, by Aslan, the figure. He can't do it himself. And so he fights with the monster, which is himself. Yeah, but it's a fantastic example, yes.
I think it's fascinating that as it describes Eustace's discovery that the monster is him. You know, he moves his hand and he discovers it slowly to discover the monster is him. When you look like a monster, move like a monster, and act like a monster, you're a monster. And so, yes, Eustace discovers that, and then he's kind of stuck with it and tries to cope with it.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
I have a wondering about, and a curiosity, what you might say about the beginnings and endings. You both at various times talked about them, and you also both talked about the way stories with their beginnings and endings are a little bit modular in both of these stories. They can move around. You know, the beginning, there's seems like an ending in one story is actually something else. I'm sure I'm not the only one who noticed that you displayed the chronicles in the incorrect
I did. I wondered
chronological order.
I did do that. I did that on purpose.
But of course, it's because the beginnings and endings sometimes flip around. There's like a fractal that can be seen in different ways. Anyway, I'm just kind of curious. And the Old Testament, of course, has alternate canonical orders too. So,
That's true.
Anyway, just interested in your thinking about the way they're not cyclical, retellings and beginnings, but they can be combined in different ways.
Let me say how I thought about this, because I was like, I'm not going to get through tonight without someone objecting that I present them in this order. So thank you. I would have been disappointed. Thank you. I would have doubted I was in the right. Am I in the Wade Center? Yeah. So the thing that I reflected on in this choice was the apocalypses themselves, because the apocalypses are the latest part of the Old Testament, but they reach back the farthest into the past, right? It's with the books of Enoch, written 3rd century, probably the earliest forms of the books of Enoch, 3rd century BCE, but they go back and retell the beginning. And so when I was thinking, where do I find the most apocalyptic monsters in these 7? I'm like, well, I'm going to find it in the prequel and the end, because that's exactly what the apocalyptic literature does. They're written later, like in terms of their conceptualization, but they're going back to the earliest parts, even earlier than most of the biblical witness goes. So I thought of The Magician's Nephew as a little bit like the books of Enoch, yes? And then The Last Battle, of course, as kind of the hinting of Enoch and the end of Daniel and Revelation. So I focused on those 2 stories because I viewed them as the most apocalyptic presentation of monsters, even in their historical, even in the historical relation to the time that they describe. Yeah, so thank you, yeah.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the idea of the monster being us, the monster within, and also the Dr. Buster, you talked about the recognition of the numinous.
Yeah.
So kind of like because if the monster is simply us, that, I don't know, that seems a bit flat. So is it like the both and of the within and without, or perhaps like almost encountering the other within?
Yeah, yeah. I like participation with the monsters. So you went, so this is what, this is why I chose the language of participation. And then you chose to go beyond it. So I'll give my answer and then yours.
Sure.
So I do think the monstrous is something real and wholly other. That's why I think the numinous is helpful. I also don't think, and Beverly Gavent I think puts this well, and I'm not going to be able to quote her from memory, but she says and she's talking about principalities and powers in this phrase, but I'm going to use the monstrous as I think a welcome paraphrase of that. So I think the monstrous is real, but we don't fully know its origin and form. Yes? So I think it's a real other thing than us, but we can participate in it. And again, I maybe didn't, let me clarify here between what I'm sure of and what I think Lewis says. So I think Lewis is very certain we can fully become it. And that becomes clear in Weight of Glory, and it becomes clear in The Great Divorce, yes? So just in terms of describing Lewis's viewpoint, there's a sense in which the monstrous is other, but you can become it in almost its fullest sense, yes? I don't want to put words in his mouth, he's not here to defend himself, but it seems to me from reading him in that way, you can become it. So I do think the monstrous is something primordial, old, and other than us, because we're not primordial. We were born, last week. In terms of the ages of the world, it precedes us, and I think Lewis's comment that he views evil itself as preceding human creation, which I think is interesting. Yes, I'll have to think about that. So I do think it's other and has some other form of being. But we can participate in it, and I'm considering Lewis's thesis that we can fully become it. I don't know what that looks like. Yes, is that, you're getting at the limits of understanding and conceptualization, so it's a really good question.
So when I said we had two more questions, Dr. Walton.
Well, you said you went beyond this, yes, consciously.
Well, but what I was observing wasn't to deny the otherness of the monstrous, but to recognize that it doesn't stop there.
That's right.
That it's within humanity, as Daniel encountered it in Empire, and that again, that it is actually within us that we can become it, as Eustace does.
That's right. And Uncle Andrew, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we need to see the whole range of it. If we stop simply by thinking of it as the other,
That's right.
and don't see it in more closer observation, we're going to misconstrue our danger.
Yeah.
All right, this is our last question. This is your bonus question. Here we go.
Thank you very much for those excellent lectures. Maybe not questions, but some reflections, if I may. I'm just thinking that the concept of this dualistic, apocalyptic thinking might be perhaps associated with Charles Williams, the third Inkling's idea of the terrifying goodness. There is this famous passage from Descending to Hell, when Pauline asks Peter Stanhope, if things are terrifying, can they be good? And Peter Stanhope responds, yes, surely. Our tremors to measure the omnipotence. And also Charles Williams' maxim, this also is thou, neither is this thou. About this, the monsters are us. And the final thing, I just remember this passage from Tolkien's letter to Walter Hooper, I think it's the 20th of February 1968, referring to dragons. There was a discussion in the common room. So Tolkien writes, I remember Jack, C.S. Lewis, telling me a story of Brightman, the distinguished ecclesiastic scholar who used to sit quietly in common room, saying nothing except on rare occasions. Jack said that there was a discussion on dragons one night, and at the end, Brightman's voice was heard to say, I have seen a dragon. Silence. Where was that? He was asked. On the Mount of Olives, he said. And then he relapsed into silence and never before his death explained what he meant. So I just wanted to add this. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Lewis talks a little bit about this in his essays, his essay in honor of Charles Williams. So yeah, that's what that's like.
All right.
I have a story.
Well, maybe we can hear that afterwards. I think we're done for the evening. Thank you very much. Let's thank Dr. Buster and Dr. Walton.